Excellent. Well, thank you so much for having me, and yeah, for inviting me here. I'm super excited to talk to you all today. So I'm going to be talking about some of my qualitative work today. I'm a mixed methods researcher, so I generally am a methodological pragmatist. I use whatever methods I have at my disposal. So this is going to be one of my qualitative projects, which is looking at how prefiguring a vegan future in a meat-dominating present, how experiencing this kind of temporary majority helps to empower minority-driven social change. So the talk's going to be about half an hour, so we should have plenty of time, hopefully, for Q&A and thoughts afterwards. And I'm kind of currently writing this work up, so if anyone has any ideas for literatures I should bring in or ways that I could frame this, I'd be really delighted to hear about that. So that'd be great. So to start off with, I'd really like to thank all of my supervisors. So I have quite a large supervision team, and they're all amazing. They all put up with me quite a lot, so that's great. So my team is Tim Kurz, who's at UWA in Perth, and then I have Lida Blackwood and Maureen Whitmarsh at the University of Bath, Jan Willem Bolderdijk at the University of Groningen in marketing, and Saffron O'Neill on human geography at Exeter. So quite an interdisciplinary team, which has kind of informed a lot of my work. So just to kind of start off with, I think we can all agree that most of the goal of social action is to change the future in some kind of way. So when we think about the really extreme social movements or the really visible social movements, they're all trying to make small or large changes to the way that the future works. So these kind of examples here, we have the Black Lives Matter movement fighting for like racial equality. We have the Women's March fighting for feminism and women's equality. And then on the bottom left, we also have the 1.5 Stay Alive March, which is also associated with the school strikes, which are kind of like fighting for climate justice and environmental equality and justice. And I hope this does not come as a surprise to some of you. If it does, I'm terribly sorry. But we are currently in a climate ecological emergency. This is a kind of graph called the warming stripes. So what this does is it shows the rate of global temperature change from 1850 to 2021. And as you can see, things are getting quite bad in terms of global warming, but also other respects related to the climate crisis. And the evidence is pretty inconclusive that this is human caused as well. So we are seeing a lot of environmental changes that are caused by humans. And when we think about the climate crisis and the environmental crisis, it's kind of tempting to see it as something that's happening to the environment and to nature and animals, but actually the way that I see it and the way that many other scholars see it is it's kind of like a really wicked problem that involves lots of social issues, economic issues, lots of justice issues. So you might have seen some versions of this kind of cartoon graphic where climate change is in the middle, but it's just one of the waves that is related to this overall crisis, which also includes biodiversity collapse. The resolution on that's really bad. But the other two waves are recession in blue there, and also COVID and pandemics in the red, because climate change has been shown to increase pandemic risk as well. And in some versions of this cartoon, there's an even bigger wave, which comes over biodiversity collapse, which is kind of talking about sort of war, famine, in societal instability. So when we're talking about climate change, we're not just talking about the environment, we're talking about all of these social crises that are wrapped up in changes to the environment. And there's a huge need for a just transition towards a more sustainable future as well. So there's a lot of kind of climate justice approaches, which are kind of talking about where the moral responsibility for these changes lie and where the moral responsibility for behavior change lies. So making sure that those who are most disadvantaged by climate change aren't also the ones who are forced to change the most, kind of making sure that those most responsible are making the most changes. So this is a huge social and moral problem, which is kind of what I'm most interested in and what got me into this PhD. And a lot of societal behavior change is neat. So sometimes when we talk about climate change, there's a risk that kind of techno-savior approaches kind of come along. So we can talk about carbon sequestration, so the idea that we can take carbon out of the air and put it straight back into the ground, or like these kind of negative emissions technologies, so they're called nets. And these sound great, but they're actually not that feasible currently. So you can see these graphs here are 4 sort of pathways to behavior change noted by the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who kind of suggest how we should deal with this as a society. But you can see from the graphs on the right-hand side here that all of these graphs involve a huge amount of behavior change in that they require a load of fossil fuel reduction. and changes to agriculture and forestry. So what we're talking about here is actually involving a lot of human behavior change as well. So we're talking about transport changes, energy changes in relation to fossil fuels, but also changes to meat consumption in terms of agriculture and forestry. And the most effective solution that doesn't involve all of these kind of carbon sequestration technologies, which we can't use yet, is the one that involves a lot of extreme behavior change quite quickly. So that's the problem that a lot of us social scientists working in the environmental domain are dealing with right now, the idea that we need to make a lot of change quite quickly, but this is quite difficult. And meat and dairy consumption is the problem that I'm particularly interested in. I'm also interested in the problem of transport and driving, and I was going to do a lot of my PhD on sort of flight shaming and transport behaviors, but unfortunately for me, I started about 3 months before the COVID pandemic and everyone stopped traveling. So my PhD is now mostly around this kind of meat and dairy consumption as one of the primary harms. And I think a lot of these harms are sort of self-evident, but just to kind of go over them for people who might not be familiar. So there's a huge sort of moral argument against meat and dairy consumption in terms of millions of animals are slaughtered, millions more are kind of mistreated in sort of factory farming environments. And there's also a huge amount of mental health and like physical health impacts on people working in these agricultural industries, particularly on abattoir workers. The meat and dairy consumption also has really bad environmental impact. It requires a huge amount of land use. So when we're talking about carbon sequestration and negative emissions technologies, they actually also require a huge amount of land use to actually put this carbon under the ground, which we currently don't have access to because so much of that land is being used by agriculture. So they also cause animals, also like livestock, also cause a huge amount of greenhouse gas emissions, and lots of habitats are destroyed to make room for livestock and farming. But then also on a very individual level, there are huge health negatives around meat and dairy consumption. To name just two here, because they are myriad, we have high blood pressure is associated with meat consumption, and also increased chances of cancer is associated with various levels of meat and dairy consumption. So we know that this is a bad thing generally, but a lot of people still do. So we can kind of think about how can we solve this problem of meat consumption? And one of the answers is veganism. So veganism is the idea that you do not eat any meat or dairy or animal products. You don't consume any of this. And veganism is growing in like sort of exponentially actually in recent years. It's becoming a very popular movement, a very popular identity that people are taking on. And people are actually taking this on for a variety of reasons. So it can be assumed that vegans are actually solely morally motivated by the animal rights argument, but that's not entirely true. People are motivated by health, weight management, animal welfare, environment, antibiotic concerns, but also taste. And people really don't like the taste of meat. So we know that veganism is increasing and that this could be the answer to solving the problem of meat and dairy consumption. However, everyone hates vegans, right? Everyone finds vegans really annoying. And this is a problem because the way that we conceptualize vegans in the work I've been doing with some of my supervisors like Kurz and Safran Anil, as well as Annayah categorizes veganism as one of these moralized minority practice identities. So these are particular kind of identities that can be interpreted in light of a moral concern, whether it's the case that the person identifying with this identity actually endorses this moral concern. People might interpret a vegan as doing it for moral reasons, even if they're not actually doing it for that. They're in the vast societal minority, it is increasing exponentially, but estimates show that in the UK, at least, vegans are still about 5% of people, which is not a very large amount. They're centered around very highly visible specific practices, namely eating, which is also a really social practice as well. So it's very hard to hide the fact that you're a vegan, which can make it really difficult to avoid things like moral and social derogation. And they're also centered around these identity labels, namely, you are a vegan. And if you want to do vegan practices, often you might have to go up to a restaurant and ask for the vegan option or the vegan menu. So when you're trying to eat plant-based, you might have to already buy into this kind of vegan identity. And this can be a problem. And I mean, the paper that Tim and I wrote on this explains this much better. So I'd encourage you to check that out. So it's very early in the morning for me and I'm not super eloquent right now, but the paper's very good. And another paper that's relevant here is this paper by Jan Willem and Lisa Jans, which looks at the idea of minority-driven social change. So often we can kind of think about like societal minorities as having problems enacting social change, but actually in the environmental domain, they can be really, really important and pave the way for these kind of tipping points in society. So I think this paper actually draws on research which shows that the tipping point for a behavior to actually become mainstream isn't as high as you think it is. I think it's about 25% of people. So even though people are vegans are in the societal minority, it might not actually take that much to mainstream the behavior at all. And the paper argues that policymakers can help speed up this sort of minority influence process by offering top-down support for minorities by giving them voice, and also initiatives by non-governmental organizations like charities or like Veganuary can also help increase this social change process by doing initiatives like Veganuary and things like that. And there are also just a huge amount of social and psychological barriers to veganism. We wrote this paper with my old office mate, Chris Bryant, who does really cool work on lab-grown meats. So if you have an interest in that, you should definitely check his work out. And we did this absolutely mammoth review paper, which we thought was going to be really easy, but ended up being, I think, about like 30 pages long, kind of talking about all of the literature that's coming out of this area, because there is quite a lot. So this paper talks about all of the barriers that could kind of come as someone is moving through this trans-theoretical model of behavior change in terms of veganism. So at every single stage of this, there's a sort of different bias or a different process that might actually serve to take people out of the behavior change. And when we also look at people who did go vegetarian, so it's a similar kind of identity, but people who went vegetarian before and then have stopped being vegetarian for some reason, we can also see there's a lot of social and psychological barriers from them, namely that the social support, people really felt like vegetarianism wasn't socially supported by their friends. And they also had some misconceptions about how healthy it was as well. So we're working on that paper on ex-vegetarians at the moment. But all this is to say that veganism can be quite difficult for a lot of people, even though it seems to be the solution for a lot of these societal problems. So given all of this, and given that veganism is probably a good thing, but it's really difficult for people to engage in, I was asking myself these two questions. So how can we convince people that a meat-free future is actually possible? And how can we empower the minority groups that are already working towards that future in their daily lives? And I think I'm looking at the context of vegans because that's my research area, but I think this also applies to a lot of other social movements who are trying to engage in this visioning process of how do we actually convince people that this future is possible. So just to kind of take a step back a little bit, when I'm thinking about these research questions, I want to draw in two of these books that I've read, which are kind of more in the activist and political domain, which I think were really informative in this area. So the first book was Emergent Strategy, which is kind of like an activist handbook. And a quote from this is saying, "We are in an imagination battle. So I often feel like I'm trapped inside someone else's capability. I feel like I am trapped inside someone else's imagination, and I must engage my own imagination to break free." So we can think of these kind of systems that dominate, that are dogmatic, as kind of controlling people's access to alternatives. And the other book that I love, which I would really recommend anyone pick up, because it's only about 100 words, but it's a really cool perspective on capitalism in particular, by Mark Fisher. So Capitalist Realism, the best quote from this book says that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is the end of capitalism. So when we think about a lot of social issues, some people will be like, they can't actually think of an answer. Like, we can't think of a way to solve the climate crisis that doesn't involve some kind of like capitalist innovation or capitalist like technology. And that's partially how these kind of systems function, is to sort of limit people's imagination. So from an activist and political perspective, working on people's ability to imagine different is really important. And it's also important to vegans. So ideally, if we're thinking of the ultimate intervention for how to get people to think about the future, ideally, we might want to start with time travel, right? I'm British, so I'm a massive Doctor Who nerd. And I know that, if you could just put people in the TARDIS and take them to a meat-free or a meat-reduced future, they'd probably be a bit more convinced that it was possible. And there's loads of this kind of sort of visioning literature. So I've been recommended The Ministry for the Future quite a few times as sort of, and also The Future Earth is a really good book, which kind of puts yourself in the perspective of a world that's already changed. We can think about speculative fiction in the same way. So these two novellas, which are some of my favorites, they kind of cross sci-fi fantasy in the environmental domain. They talk about what the future might look like if we take, the environmentally friendly path or the environmentally unfriendly path. And I think this film that recently came out a couple of months ago now, I think, Everything Everywhere All at Once, is also just a really cool visualization of what multiple futures and multiple paths could look like. So trying to expand people's understanding of what is possible. We could actually do time travel, or we could use these kind of novel techniques, which I would like to do in the future. But I'm a social scientist, so I'm kind of interested in how we can prefigure this kind of future in the present. And prefigurative politics has a lot to say about how we might go about doing this. So just a quote from this book. So a prefigurative approach seeks to create the new society in the shell of the old by developing counter-hegemonic institutions and modes of interaction that embody the desired transformation. In this sense, a prefigurative strategy is based on the principle of direct action, of directly implementing the changes one seeks, rather than asking others to make the changes on one's behalf. So it's the idea that instead of taking people to that future in sci-fi sense, we create the future in the present and show people today that it's possible today to empower them to create it themselves. And just another quote to kind of expand on this value of prefiguration. So prefiguration as a strategy for social movements involves scenarios where protesters express the political ends of their actions through their means, or where they create experimental or alternative social arrangements or institutions. So one example of this would be in the Extinction Rebellion protests in London, all of the food served there, served to the protesters, is free, but it's also vegan. So they're kind of saying, we want this vegan future to happen, and we are going to create it for you here as a sort of microcosm of what we hope to see in the future. So thinking about vegans and thinking about these people who are highly morally motivated to change the future, but maybe struggle to convince people that it's possible and maybe have issues kind of maintaining their own veganism because of social and psychological issues, I had this question of, how does experiencing a prefigurative vegan majority event change people's relationship to their vegan identity and specifically their vegan activism? So to address this, I went to the Vegan Campout, which is an event that's kind of held in the north of England pretty much every year. So there's over 10,000 vegans that attend for the weekend. It's a camp out, so you can see the campsite on the left-hand side. And the idea is that the entire event is vegan. So all of the speakers are vegan, all of the food is vegan, all of the produce is vegan. It's actually really hard to eat meat in this environment. So it's kind of prefiguring the sort of vegan future in the present and showing people that it is possible. So I was interested to see how this impacted people, whether it was sort of an effective intervention for people, or if it made them just actually see the future and be really disappointed. Something that could have potentially happened, but thankfully didn't. So just in terms of my methodology, so I conducted field interviews around people's experiences of the camp out. So this was at the end of the event as well. So I was like running around on the final morning. I woke up super early and then I was just like running around as people were packing up, asking them, how did the event change you? How was your experience? What was good? What was bad? In terms of the approach, so I took an inductive thematic analysis approach. So thematic analysis is quite a popular qualitative method by Braun and Clark. And the idea was that because I'm researching a minority group, I really want, in a novel context, I really wanted their experiences to be front and center of this analysis. So I took a realist epistemology, which is an epistemology that basically takes what participants say as their version of the truth and just interprets it as that. So in terms of the participants, I think vegans in the UK are often kind of stereotyped as just being like white women, but I actually managed to get quite white young women in particular, but I managed to get quite a fairly diverse range of participants. I think most of these participants were white, so there's a lack of racial diversity at this event, which kind of tracks with stereotypes of the vegan movement, but also stereotypes of the north of England as well. So that's worth considering. But in terms of genders, we had a mixture of genders, a mixture of ages. But yeah, like I said, most people were from the north of England. So in terms of what I found, so I'm just going to run through these really quickly. So I had these kind of 5 themes. So these 5 themes were related to how the event sort of changed people's relationship with their vegan identity. So I'm just going to go through these with some quotes to kind of illustrate the point. So the first theme was recharging. So people felt like they had a renewed sense of purpose and conviction in their veganism after attending the campout. So there are two quotes here. The first one is from someone who said, "You can kind of get lost in your day-to-day. I think this kind of just recenters you and brings you back, lights that fire again." People use this metaphor of like lighting the fire again, like the spark again quite often. So the second quote is, "We've just come away being like so inspired." And sometimes like you meet people and they're like, "Why are you vegan?" And sometimes it feels like no one gets it. Or like when you're not around lots of vegan people, it's so nice to have what I'm doing the right thing, like it's nice to have it all confirmed. So this kind of idea that attending the event makes clarifies the sort of vegan message, helps people feel stronger about their convictions and sort of recharge to go back out into the world as vegan. In terms of social connection, this was actually probably the most prominent theme, which is kind of consistent with some work that I've done at these kind of festivals in the past as well. So a lot of participants felt more socially connected to other vegans after attending the campout. These two quotes here, someone saying, "It's a connector, it's a real connector, this campout, helping vegans to connect and to meet each other." And then another person said, "A big thing for me, I've never met another vegan in real life." And this was particularly interesting for me because in my PhD and in my research in general, I kind of had made this implicit assumption that because vegans are a really close-knit identity group, that they're well connected to each other. Like I think a lot of us can identify people that we know who are vegans, and we can assume that there's like a whole vegan group of people who are just constantly talking to each other. But that's not the case for all vegans, right? So this vegan was actually from Birmingham, which is quite a big city in the UK, and it's quite like well stocked with vegans and vegan restaurants and things like that. So I was quite surprised. So I chased her up on this a little bit. And she was saying that it wasn't actually the geography that was the issue for her. It was more her introversion and her social anxiety that was stopping her from meeting other people. So she kind of felt like there was this huge barrier to meeting other vegans that she had to pass through. And the event attending the Vegan Campout actually removed a lot of that social barrier for her. So when we're thinking about these kind of people who take on these identities, we shouldn't assume that they know each other and that they're well socially connected just by virtue of taking on these identities. And attending these events can really help them socially connect to other people, which we know is a protective factor in helping people continue activism and continue their veganism. So in terms of the next theme, I'm not sure, I think the name of this theme will change because I'm not sure how best to categorize this. But basically, some participants felt like the campout allowed them a contrasting environment which they could reflect on their place in the real world. So people would kind of be able to use the new environment of the vegan campout to sort of make comments about their past and about their standard homes and growing up in rural environments and things like that. So in terms of the first quote here, we have someone who's saying, "It's such a progressive environment. Sometimes people just need to be surrounded by that to really understand." So it's the environment itself that is making a change for this person. And someone who was, the second quote was actually someone who was talking about how clean the campsite was relative to other festivals. And they were saying, "You are disgusted by the difference, but proud of the difference at the same time." So I think there's potentially something in this data set about the campout providing a basis for social comparison or kind of group comparison here, kind of saying that all vegans are good, all non-vegans are messy and that kind of thing. We did have a couple of accounts that contrasted this, that were kind of actually saying that they were really disappointed when other vegans were like messing around or keeping them up at night because they expected vegans to actually be like really good and really kind. So I think there was some element of like, some people were recognizing that the group was sort of similar to each other, but some people were recognizing that just because people shared a group label doesn't mean they share all of their values. And that was, a potential issue for some people. So that's something I need to go into more in my analysis as well. And then in terms of the next theme, so we have this theme of recognition and belonging. So participants felt like they were part of a group that they belonged to, that recognized them for who they were without any derogation. So the first quote here, "I was finally in the midst of a group of people that shared my ideals." And the second quote, "It's kind of cool because we all have the same kind of base, like the same wavelength, we all shoot off in different directions. We all respect each other, and it seems that way at least. It feels very safe, like a community vibe." So a lot of people were talking about how the event kind of felt like a really family-friendly atmosphere. They felt kind of safe around other people. Again, this might be because they all had a shared social identity, because we know that that links to feelings of safety and sometimes feelings of complacency as well. And actually, some of these people described, so at the end of this quote, say, for all the people you meet, it's just like you've known them forever. And someone else said that people at the event seemed like a group of friends that they just haven't met yet. So there was this feeling of like recognition, of solidarity amongst the group, even if they hadn't directly socially interacted with them. And then the last theme, which I think was probably the most interesting to me, was this idea of going further. So some participants felt inspired to go further in their interpersonal and societal activism. So when I presented this to my supervisors, they asked me if this was people going further in terms of their own lifestyle. And it actually wasn't that, because most of the vegans that I spoke to were already pretty extreme in their diet and in their lifestyle. They wouldn't consume any animal products, which kind of makes sense, because I think the event is sort of self-selecting in that sense. Like maybe you only want to go if you feel like a proper vegan or a full vegan. But when it came to people's activism, they would say things like this, like, it's pushed things for me. I want to get more involved. I want to be part of that. And this person in the second quote was actually saying, in a very spiritual sense. So they were talking from a Buddhist perspective, but I've got to help other beings. I felt the call this weekend. And they were kind of approached this call with a bit of trepidation. They didn't expect to have this spiritual reaction to the event. And they were kind of frustrated, to be honest, that something else had come up for them that they needed to deal with. But they were kind of ready to sort of approach this and engage in more activism after the event. So those are the 5 themes that I have so far. In terms of other interesting points, we did ask people explicitly about the downsides of the event, so what they didn't enjoy. And most of these were actually pretty practical. So in terms of, there were large queues at the event, the toilets were messy, that kind of thing. And it seemed like actually the event sort of struggled with its own popularity in many ways, because a lot of the food vendors were used to working at events where the vegan food wasn't actually that popular, whereas everyone was always wanting vegan food at this event. So there were sort of issues, like practical issues there that people mentioned, but they didn't really talk about the social side of the event as something that was a downside. People enjoyed the social aspect of the event the most, and a lot of people actually commented that they wanted even more social time, which is pretty surprising to me. As someone who goes to festivals, I think oftentimes going to a festival is a pretty individual experience, like you kind of just want to experience the acts and be with your friends or on your own. But here they kind of wanted these organized sort of meeting events or networking events where they can meet vegans in their area. And some people actually spoke about how they would organize these sort of networking events themselves. So people would set up like WhatsApp groups and lots of different things to connect vegans. So this idea that the event was a way to connect disparate people was really important to these participants. But this social aspect wasn't the reason that people tended to attend in the first place. So people were initially attracted to the event by the acts, which would usually be, so I think the year that I went, Russell Brand was headlining. And there's a couple of like vegan, headliners, I guess. But there's also a bunch of people on social media that people are really attracted to. But it tended to be that people were enjoying this kind of social side of the event more, which I thought was really interesting. So in terms of my overall findings, the Vegan Campout was an empowering and connecting event from vegans. They reported feeling empowered and inspired to do more vegan activism explicitly after leaving the event. And the campout seemed to mitigate some of these potential feelings of activist burnout and frustration that might come with being a moral minority. So I have a bunch of remaining questions, which I've been encouraged by my supervisors to leave until after I finish my PhD, because this could be a huge project. But in terms of, I think this is a really interesting qualitative exploration, but there are still some remaining quantitative questions, like how might attending the campout change vegans in the long term? Do they actually engage in more activism like they say they will? Is that something that's just a quirk of the people that I spoke to? It'll be interesting to look at that quantitatively. And also, how might attending the event impact non-vegans? So when I was interviewing people, I didn't select them based on whether they were vegan or not. And we actually spoke to one vegetarian. I'm actually vegetarian myself as well, so I can sympathize with this approach. And the vegetarian was saying that they actually experiencing the vegan future was even more profound for them because they'd had so many misgivings about veganism, and the event had convinced them that it was actually possible and actually good. Also, this idea of are the reasons that people attend the event actually consistent with the benefits that they get from attending? This disconnect between attending for the acts and gaining the social benefit, I think, is really interesting. And in terms of festival marketing, I think that could be something that would be interesting to explore. And could the campout function as an intervention for increasing vegan behaviors and discouraging stigma both among vegans and among non-vegans? So I think we did have some plans to do a kind of quantitative longitudinal study. But again, once I finish my PhD, I might come back to this, but I need to write up my other studies in the meantime. So we'll come back to this next year, maybe. Cool, and that is everything. So again, thank you so much to all of my supervision team. And we are really hoping to have this written up fairly soon. So I'm kind of hoping that I'll have a preprint ready in the next month or two so I can send around to anyone who's interested. And like I said, because I'm writing it up, if anyone has any thoughts about literature that I should definitely include in the write-up, perspectives that I could take that I haven't mentioned yet, I'd love to hear it. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much for that, Annayah. It was really rich data set, very, very interesting. Does anyone have any questions?
I do sort of have one. It's probably not a very fun one though. So I was just wondering, as you're reading through the quotes from your thematic analysis, whether you would get similar kind of answers from majority group members if they were put in a similar kind of environment for something that they were interested in.
Yeah. So in terms of whether it's potentially just an interesting, I think that I'm not sure, because I think the social connection element is something that's potentially unique to the minority group, in terms of maybe not being able to as easily connect with other people because they are in the societal minority. I think things like being encouraged to go further, I think might well apply to majority groups, in terms of just thinking if you, some of my friends go to like gaming festival where they're like, there's like a LAN party or something for the weekend, and then they come out of it and they're like, no, I actually really like gaming, oh my gosh. And just like speaking of my own experience of music festivals, you always come away from it thinking like, oh, I really like dancing, or I really like singing, like I want to do more of that. But I think in terms of the going further, maybe the difference is the activist side of it. Like I don't come away from a music festival thinking, you know, I'm really gonna like persuade all of my friends to come to this festival, like
or become a musician.
Yeah. And I think because you know, maybe that's a goal, I don't know. But I think because vegans sort of have this sort of conversionary collective action objective, which is the idea that we want to convince as many people as possible to reduce or preferably like stop their meat consumption. So I think maybe because that's inherent in the identity, going to the event encourages that activist side. And also in terms of the activism, some people were talking about, it varied quite a lot in terms of what people were saying. So some people were just saying that I work in a rural community and it's now really important for me to have that conversation with the people that I work with and let them know that this is me. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. So I think like that's also a really helpful way for me to frame it, to sort of think about what's unique about this sort of minority experiencing the majority. Because I think this could also apply, like, I mean, the huge example is like Pride events, right? Like, so if you're LGBT and you're in the minority and then you go to Pride and you're like, oh, wow, like there are people like me. I think a lot of the same things might apply. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Annayah. I really enjoyed your presentation as well. I just want to say, great job.
Great. Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Tegan?
Yeah, jump in there if that's okay. I think the other example, and maybe this is a literature you are drawing on, Annayah, but not, I think it's very relevant, is the mass gatherings work by Nick Hopkins and colleagues. And a lot of the studies that they've looked at are religious festivals, you know, people celebrating and enacting their identities in a context that is, you know, to do with a sort of spiritual identity. And I think that similarly, like there are strong elements of, you know, of deeply held belief, right, that are being lived out in a context like this. So I think you might be able to draw some clear analogy from that group, and obviously they take a social identity perspective too.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think I think a lot of people actually compare veganism to like religion as well, which I think is quite interesting, like in terms of how it's experience.
I'm definitely not trying to necessarily, but I think
it's
about what you can get out of those kind of positive events from an identity perspective. I think parallels.
Yeah, I think I think that would be a really helpful perspective to bring in. I'm kind of I was sort of a bit unsure as to in what literature to pitch this stuff, because there's obviously the huge social identity stuff, but then there's so much in the like crowd psychology and mass gatherings literature as well. So I think it probably is just going to sit in the middle of all of those things, as with a lot of the work that I do. But I've done some work on secular mass gatherings as well, namely like festivals in the UK and US, and we don't find exactly the same thing, because it's more of an experience of like personal transformation, like I've changed who I am as a person. But I think that literature could also apply. So yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. I'll bring that in.
Michelle?
Yeah, thanks, Annayah. It was a great talk, and I had similar thoughts that Mila and Tegan sort of had around sort of identities and which ones that sort of works for non-opinion based groups and sort of majority groups. But then I was also thinking about groups that are sort of activist or opinion based, or those sorts of things that might be less positive, so we think of veganism and vegan behaviors as positive behaviors, even if they're stigmatized in particular ways. I think there's a recognition that these are sort of good things. But I'm thinking of sort of like, I don't know, like incel groups or misogynistic groups, or racist groups, or those sorts of things, and whether these processes, I don't know, some sort of Nazi campout equivalent or whatever that is. I'm not trying to make light of it, but just sort of saying that these same processes could also buoy up and bring together and promote negative behaviors, I guess, in that same sort of way. I mean, this is always the argument, right? Like, group-based processes can be good and bad depending on, the norms of the group.
Yeah, I think that's such a fascinating point, and I totally agree. Like, I think when we're thinking about, because I got caught up on this in my confirmation examination as well, like in terms of could like a terrorist be considered like a MMPI group member, and I'm like, well, yeah. Because they're like morally motivated around a specific practice that's in the societal minority. Like, it does go both ways. And I think it's interesting to think about that, because then I think that's partially why disrupting those kind of events is a really good activist technique. Because if we can say that these events have really powerful circumstances for group, like empowering groups and like encouraging them to go further and do more activism, then the flip side is that, maybe actually understanding that these events are really important to those groups also shows us why disrupting those events and not allowing people to gather, like thinking of sort of anti-fascist approaches, like post-war in the UK, where people would just disrupt fascist rallies and would just like be annoying basically and not allow them to happen and not allow that kind of stuff to happen. I guess I love
that tuba player that used to go around, whenever Nazis were marching and would just play the tuba. I just thought that was the best disruption ever. But yeah, I guess it's really interesting to think of the other side of it. Yeah, if you want to reduce behaviors or reduce, So yeah, no, that's great. That's really interesting. Thank you.
I think the other point that I was thinking of in relation to that though is I think there's sometimes I struggle with this in my own work, because it's kind of like there is an element of like who is defining those groups as bad, right? Because I think you can say that like a lot of like, so we have like farmers protests in the Netherlands, a lot of kind of groups are sort of demonizing environmental activists at the moment in a similar way, and kind of saying you want to do bad things, you want to stop us, that kind of thing. So to me, like, anyone who's sexist, fascist, like, is inherently bad, but it's kind of tricky to word that in a way that, I don't know, maybe that's just like it's interesting to think about, because it's a question I get asked quite often. I should maybe just work on like crafting the blog response to that. But yeah, it's an interesting perspective to think that maybe understanding why these events are important in a social psychological sense could also help us disrupt events that are negative for society in general. Really cool, thank you.
Anyone else have any questions?
I have more of a comment. It's Kate here. I'm just on my phone.
Cool.
Everyone can hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's more, I can get the sense that this thesis is finished and you've got a whole line of work mapped out going forward. But I was, as you were talking, I was sort of thinking about two things. One thing you said early, which was that the stereotype that people have of vegans is very negative, but yet many vegans are motivated to try and sort of encourage people to care more about the environment, and one way of doing that is to take on veganism.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, when these groups come together at these kind of events, is there any kind of thinking of strategy or social change, or what actions we might take that are likely to be more effective versus less effective? And the stereotype, of course, is a barrier, perhaps, for influence, full stop. So do those things come into conflict, or are they explicitly thought about?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So in terms of whether it's thought about explicitly at the event, there was kind of a bit of a tension among participants there. So there were loads of these kind of talks which were about at the campout, which were about like activism, and so there'd be talks which was like how to debunk the 10 myths about veganism, like how to engage in collective action, like stories from people who had engaged in this collective action. And some of the participants really enjoyed engaging with that side of it. So they were like, we've gone to all the talks, like we've learned so much that we can take back. But then there were other participants who were kind of like, I don't understand why these talks are ongoing, because we've already all made the change to be vegan, and I'm here to celebrate my veganism, and I don't want to think about these horrible things, because a lot of people do go vegan because of this sort of sense of like moral harm and moral obligation. They wanted the weekend to be a sort of celebration rather than a moment for strategizing. So I think there was definitely different opinions on that. It did come up, so it would be potentially interesting for me to expand on that a little bit more in the analysis. I think with regard to the overall question of whether the label can be strategic or harmful, I think, that's something that the other studies in my PhD are looking at as well from a meat eater perspective. So I have a couple of studies which are mostly qualitative, sort of from the vegan, or I think I have vegetarians and flexitarians as well, about how they define their identities, why these identities are helpful for them. Namely, it seems to be that, the bright side of the coin is that the identities are helpful because they help people find a community, they help them find resources, like they help them feel motivated. But then when you look at the flip side in my other studies, which is how these identities are perceived by meat eaters or by majority group members, they can be perceived as a bit of a barrier. So we have one study which is looking at the difference between a vegan label and a plant-based label. And it seems like there's not actually that much difference on the label type on behavior change in a direct way, but it seems to be that the vegan label is perceived as stricter and more difficult, which in turn makes people less willing to endorse the vegan label compared to the plant-based label. So those results are a little bit messy at the moment, but it seems to be that basically if you're already motivated and already convinced that being vegan is the right thing, the label is really helpful. But if you're not convinced, then the label is not helpful. So I think how unhelpful the label is also seems to depend on your own identity as a meat eater, which makes sense, because if you're someone who's really hyper committed to eating meat, you're less likely to actually engage with the other side. So I think what my PhD doesn't look at yet is how people sort of in the ideological middle kind of react to these identities, like whether it might be that people who sit in the middle are actually more persuaded by group members compared to non-group members, or whether it's a thing that just the label is unhelpful to lots of people. So I mean, it's a really good question. It's one that is basically central to the thesis that I haven't fully answered yet, but hope to. But yeah, I mean, that was a lot of rambling. Does that answer your question? I think the
great.
side of it was central.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Yeah, thank you.
There were actually also, just while we're talking about it, there was a little bit of discussion amongst participants a couple of times. There seems to be some competition over who gets access to the vegan label as well, which is something that I'd be really interested in looking at in the future, because it seemed to be that some vegan identifying participants didn't want to use that label because they've been told by other vegans that if they weren't an activist, or if they weren't doing like protests and all of this kind of stuff, then they couldn't be a vegan. And there were other people who said that, you know, plant-based is about the diet, veganism is about the lifestyle and the ethics. So I don't know, we didn't get enough evidence about that. I think it would have to be its own project almost, kind of looking at the policing of identities, but something that really interests me is who gets access to those labels and who was kind of the gatekeeper determining who gets access or not, because I think that's partially why veganism gets a bit of a bad rep, because you have this stereotype of gatekeepers, of people saying you're not vegan enough, that kind of thing. So a sidebar that I don't have enough data to back up yet, but hopefully at some point in the future, that'd be great.
Yeah, that plant-based group, that sounds very interesting. Thanks for that.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks.
I got a question.
Yeah, just a very quick question.
Oh, quick question. Sorry. Just this might not speak necessarily to the study you did, but more so you're talking a little bit about strategies and an interest in the kind of activist side of things rather than necessarily the scientific side, I guess. We talk about the stereotypes that I guess the mainstream has about vegans in terms of content, I guess, like what are the attributes that vegans are perceived to have and why are they negative? I don't know, hippie type things and things like that. But I'm wondering if you're actually trying to convert majority group members, say mainstream members, to the message, if there's an issue, a more generic or more broader issue about dogma, perceived dogma, or perceived dogmatism on behalf of the vegan community, because that can be an affront to, I guess, people who aren't part of that, I think. So I don't know if you've thought of that or whether that would help in terms of, this is more of an activism thing, which is, I think, to some degree separate, but maybe not, and building a bit on what Kate said about the stereotype impacting on whether majority group members might, because this is a core thing, right? If you're going to change it. I don't know about dogma.
The dogma is a really interesting point, and I think it points to the sort of double-edged sword of these kind of identities. So I think in many ways, like the perceived dogma or like the strictness of the identity is sort of a protective function that is a result of vegans being like derogated and kind of forming this sort of identity group. But one of the studies that I did looked at how vegans, vegetarians, and flexitarians sort of defined their identity when they were discussing it in the group. So we kind of asked them to just be like, what is a vegan really? And like hash that out with other group members for 50 minutes, which was a really cool study. But I guess in that sense, you could kind of see the flexitarians as the potential converts. So people that have reduced their meat consumption, but not fully given it up. And the flexitarians were really, the dogma was the one, like, was something that was really putting them off. And they actually really enjoyed the flexibility of being flexitarian. They struggled a bit with like, who are we really? But I think something Claire Brouwer, who's at Groningen as well, has done some really cool work on self-forgiveness with Jan Willem about how sort of accepting imperfection and accepting we're never going to be 100% perfect is actually really important for maintaining these kind of difficult practices over time. So I think that, I mean, it's an interesting point. I think that the dogma can be off-putting, but is kind of understandable as to why some vegans adopt it. But I think ultimately adopting a kind of more flexible and forgiving notion of like reducing or like, so one thing that interests me is I'm a vegetarian who's reducing my dairy consumption quite a lot, but there's not a word for that group of people yet, even though I've encountered many people who are doing the same thing. So I'm sort of like, why isn't there a word? Maybe it's because we know that we're people who occupy this sort of middle moral space and we don't want to like define ourselves too loosely. I think there's often it's often a good thing not to define yourself, but it's also understandable when you're in a stigmatized group, the need like to define yourself. And I guess there's also the issue of something I've been thinking about is at what point of the social change kind of timeline that might also matter, because it might be that being in this sort of really strictly defined dogmatic group when you're in the vast minority, so when you're like 1% of people, is really helpful, because then people can see the community as something they can get access to, like, you know, they can go through all this, get all the reputational benefit. But maybe when it becomes more popular, having this sort of really tightly defined identity is kind of an issue. And I think veganism is getting to that point where it's like, why do you need to define yourself? Like, so when we think about like other behaviors like cycling in the Netherlands, like no one would call themselves a cyclist in the Netherlands because everyone does it. And if you call yourself a cyclist, you're a bit weird. Like, I think it will get to that point as well. So I mean, that's not an answer to your question.
No, it was more just something that came up. Yeah, just in terms of if you can change it.
But I think if you're thinking about changing it in the immediate term, I think adopting this kind of being a bit more flexible and more forgiving is, I think, the best way to get people to engage. And also, when I spoke to people about their identities, they weren't. They were also really flexible themselves, which I found really interesting. They like slipped up quite often. They would eat pizza occasionally, like they would do all these things. But the thing that differentiated the vegans from everyone else is that they kept trying, like regardless. They knew they couldn't be 100% perfect, but they kept going at it. So I think like reducing, I'm writing that paper trying to reduce the stigma that vegans are like 100% perfect all the time.
Yeah.
And embracing imperfection, I think, is important. But I've gone on for ages. So.
Thanks for the talk. That was good.
No worries. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you again very much for coming. Very, very interesting. So can I just get everyone to thank Annayah again for making and talking to us today. Be nice too if one day you could come and actually visit ANU. So
yeah, definitely. I'd love to.
Great.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Does that mean we can refer to you as the fledgetarian from now on? I'm going with fledgetarian.
Fledgetarian.
A fledgling vegan.
I love that. That's so cute. I'm going to call myself that. That's brilliant. Thank you.
Hopefully that takes off as a new label. Okay, so we'll leave it there for today. So thanks again, Annayah, and for everyone else, we'll see you again in a couple of weeks. So thank you.
If anyone wants to get in touch on email or Twitter, let me know. And if you want the preprint, I'll send it on when it's done.
Thank you.
Thank you.